It did not begin with a victory speech or a flashing banner declaring a regime had fallen. It began with silence on the water, a silence so heavy that satellite feeds looked frozen and oil terminals seemed to hold their breath. In the narrow stretch between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, where nearly a fifth of the world's oil moves every day, a decision was made that would test the limits of escalation. And if you follow real geopolitical shifts, stay with me, because this is not another regional flare-up. It is a strategic gamble with global consequences. For decades, the Strait of Hormuz has been Iran's ultimate leverage. At its narrowest, barely 24 miles wide, it funnels roughly 20% of global crude and massive volumes of LNG. Tankers crawl through it exposed and predictable. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, even Iran itself depend on this artery. So do China, India, Japan, Europe. Tehran has long threatened to close it. For years, those threats sounded theatrical, until now. On February 28th, Iranian authorities announced they were closing the strait to all vessels. At first, it seemed symbolic. Radio warnings, no confirmed mines, ships still moving. But in crises, perception moves markets faster than missiles, and fear began to spread. Then a tanker anchored off Oman was struck. Sailors were wounded. Panic rippled through shipping networks. The vessel had reportedly been linked to sanction evasion networks tied to Iran. If that is true, the message was calculated. Create fear without triggering immediate multinational retaliation. Not destruction, disruption. Psychological pressure layered onto maritime leverage. It worked. Major shipping companies paused transit. Insurance premiums surged by nearly 50% overnight. Tankers slowed at the chokepoint as executives calculated risk. When tankers hesitate, supply tightens. When supply tightens, prices react. Projections warned oil could spike toward $108 per barrel from pre-crisis levels near $60. That gap is not abstract. It becomes inflation, fuel costs, airline tickets, food prices, and political pressure far beyond the Gulf. The region, meanwhile, began to fracture. Gulf states hosting American bases insisted they were not part of an offensive war. Yet drones and missiles reportedly struck airports in Dubai, residential zones in Saudi Arabia, and civilian infrastructure across the region. Civilian casualties shift narratives fast. Tehran argued the conflict was imposed by Washington and Jerusalem. But when apartment blocks and hotels are hit, diplomacy loses control of the story. Then came the most unsettling signal. Iranian officials suggested some military units were operating under broad pre-authorizations, acting independently under general guidance. Analysts see two possibilities: contingency planning in case of leadership losses, or a chain of command under strain. Either scenario increases unpredictability. When centralized control weakens, escalation becomes harder to contain. Oman illustrates the danger. Initially spared and deeply involved in mediation, it was later reportedly struck. An apology followed, implying misalignment between diplomatic intent and military action. That is not strategic precision. That is fragmentation. And fragmentation in a heavily armed regional power raises the most dangerous question of all: who is truly in control? As this maritime crisis intensified, Washington signaled patience was ending. Reports surfaced of damage to Iranian naval assets. Then President Trump escalated the narrative further, claiming multiple Iranian naval vessels had been destroyed and that naval headquarters had been heavily damaged. The language shifted from deterrence to punishment. The message was clear: escalation would be met with direct force, and more could follow. And this is where the situation turns from crisis to crossroads. A narrow waterway, global energy flows, fragmented command structures, regional capitals under pressure, naval strikes already underway. Every move now carries multiplier effects. The next decision, whether in Tehran, Washington, or somewhere in between, may determine whether this remains a contained shock or becomes something far larger. If accurate, that is not a symbolic action. It is a systematic dismantling of maritime capability. Iran's naval doctrine has long relied on asymmetric warfare: fast attack craft, mines, anti-ship missiles, swarm tactics designed to exploit the confined geography of the Strait. The destruction of larger warships and command infrastructure would not eliminate those tactics entirely, but it would degrade coordination and reduce Tehran's ability to project sustained maritime pressure. The message would be unmistakable. Attempts to weaponize the Strait would be met not with negotiation, but with annihilation of naval assets. Yet even here, uncertainty clouds clarity. Independent verification in active conflict zones is notoriously difficult. Claims of sunk vessels, destroyed headquarters, and ongoing hunts for remaining fleet elements require confirmation. But markets and militaries do not wait for perfect data. They react to signals. And the signal from Washington was clear. Escalation dominance rests with the United States. U.S. air and naval forces can target Iranian assets across the region with precision and reach. Tehran must calculate whether symbolic disruption is worth the loss of tangible military power. At the same time, Russia and China have remained conspicuously quiet. Both maintain strategic partnerships with Iran. Both depend on Gulf energy flows. Both publicly criticize unilateral U.S. military action in other contexts. Yet their responses so far have been muted. Is this restraint tactical? Are back-channel negotiations unfolding? Or is Beijing, heavily reliant on energy imports passing through the Strait, quietly urging de-escalation behind closed doors? Silence in geopolitics can be louder than statements. And we have not yet addressed the information war. Iranian-linked bot networks have reportedly amplified narratives predicting World War scenarios, spreading panic across social media platforms. Shipping delays become proof of collapse. Insurance hikes become evidence of systemic breakdown. On the other side, U.S.-aligned accounts highlight naval strikes and regime disarray. Algorithms become battlegrounds. Perception becomes ammunition. So if you want balanced, in-depth coverage that cuts through coordinated noise campaigns, this is your moment to subscribe and hit the like button. It genuinely helps ensure that verified analysis is not drowned out by automated fear. Now step back and look at the strategic geometry. 20% of global oil, 20% of global LNG, a choke point 24 miles wide, tankers visible from shore, drones cheap and expendable, insurance sensitive to risk, markets reactive to rumor, regional states anxious about civilian casualties, a military chain of command reportedly under strain, a U.S. president publicly declaring the destruction of enemy naval assets. Each element alone is manageable. Together, they form a volatile equation. Iran attempted to hold the global economy hostage by threatening a maritime artery that connects continents. The initial radio broadcast closing the Strait failed to halt traffic. The staged or selective attack on a tanker amplified fear without triggering immediate multinational retaliation. Shipping companies paused, insurance costs soared, oil prices prepared to spike. But in response, Washington escalated vertically, targeting naval infrastructure itself. If 9 warships truly now rest at the bottom of the sea, the balance of maritime power in the Gulf has shifted dramatically in a matter of days. The question that remains is whether this is the peak or merely the midpoint. Will Tehran double down with mines, swarm tactics, or proxy operations through allied groups? Will regional states demand stronger collective security arrangements? Will OPEC's increased production offset supply shocks? Or will market psychology outpace physical barrels? And inside Iran, how sustainable is a posture in which military units operate under generalized pre-authorization amid leadership losses? History shows that choke points often become flashpoints. From the Suez Crisis to tanker wars of the 1980s, narrow waterways have drawn major powers into direct confrontation. The Strait of Hormuz is not just geography. It is leverage. It is vulnerability. It is temptation. And right now, it is a stage where miscalculation could reverberate across every gas pump and energy grid on the planet. We are watching in real time a test of escalation dominance, regime cohesion, and economic resilience. The destruction of naval assets, if confirmed, is not just a military headline. It is a strategic message broadcast across the region. Attempts to weaponize global trade corridors will carry existential costs. Whether that message deters or provokes further escalation remains to be seen. And as this story continues to unfold, as satellite images update and oil markets open and regional capitals weigh their next moves, one thing is certain. The Strait of Hormuz has once again proven that a narrow strip of water can shape the fate of global stability. Stay with this channel because what happens next will not be decided in press rooms, but in command centers, shipping lanes, and the silent calculations of leaders who know that every move now carries consequences far beyond their borders. And if you value detailed, no-hype geopolitical breakdowns like this, make sure you are subscribed and leave a like, because the next phase of this crisis is already forming beneath the surface. But here is where the story becomes even more dangerous, because the destruction of ships is only one layer of what may be unfolding beneath the surface. When a navy is degraded, it does not simply disappear, it adapts. Iran's maritime doctrine has never relied solely on large surface combatants. For decades, its strategy has revolved around asymmetry. Fast attack boats armed with anti-ship missiles, coastal defense batteries hidden in mountainous terrain, mobile launchers that can relocate within minutes, sea mines deployed quietly at night, unmanned explosive vessels that can blend with civilian traffic, and drones that cost a fraction of the missiles used to intercept them. If major vessels have indeed been sunk and command facilities damaged, Tehran may pivot entirely toward this decentralized model. And that shift could make the Strait not just contested, but chaotic. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. You do not need a blue water navy to disrupt a choke point that narrow. A handful of mines in strategic lanes can halt traffic for days while clearance operations begin. A single successful missile strike on a foreign-flagged supertanker could trigger immediate multinational naval convoys. A coordinated swarm attack could force insurance markets to classify the entire corridor as a war zone overnight. And once insurers step back, it is not missiles that stop trade. It is paperwork, liability, and risk assessments. The global economy is not only vulnerable to explosions, it is vulnerable to hesitation. Now imagine the internal dynamics inside Iran at this exact moment. If leadership figures have been targeted in previous operations and authority has been pre-delegated to field commanders, what happens when those commanders interpret general instructions differently? One unit might act cautiously, another aggressively. One might see restraint as survival, another as weakness. Fragmented command structures do not just increase unpredictability for adversaries, they increase it internally. History has shown that regimes under extreme external pressure sometimes consolidate control, but others fracture further, especially when communication lines are disrupted and fear replaces coordination. And what if the reported naval destruction is intended not only to cripple capability, but to provoke internal blame? Within Iran's political military architecture, tensions between regular armed forces and the Revolutionary Guard have always existed beneath the surface. If one branch is perceived as having failed to defend assets, narratives of responsibility begin to circulate. Who miscalculated? Who failed to anticipate? Who authorized what? These are not merely military questions, they are political ones. And political instability layered onto military confrontation multiplies risk. Meanwhile, the regional environment is shifting in real time. Gulf monarchies that have long walked a tightrope between Washington and Tehran are recalculating. Energy exporters fear prolonged disruption. Financial hubs fear investor flight. Tourism centers fear missile images on international news cycles. If civilian infrastructure continues to be struck, public opinion in these states may harden dramatically. Leaders who once advocated neutrality could find themselves pressured to align more openly with security coalitions. That, in turn, would validate Tehran's narrative of encirclement, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Then there is the American calculus. Escalation dominance does not mean escalation immunity. The United States possesses overwhelming conventional military capability in the region, including carrier strike groups, long-range bombers, stealth assets, and missile defense systems. But every additional strike deepens commitment. Every destroyed asset reduces the possibility of easy diplomatic off-ramps. At some point, the strategic objective must be defined clearly. Is the goal deterrence, punishment, regime destabilization, maritime freedom of navigation? Each objective carries different thresholds and different endgames, and ambiguity, while useful tactically, can complicate strategic exit. Energy markets are not passive spectators in this drama. If crude spikes toward triple digits and remains elevated, central banks will face renewed inflationary pressure. Governments already balancing debt burdens could confront higher borrowing costs. Developing economies dependent on imported fuel could see currency strain. Shipping rerouted around Africa instead of through the Gulf would extend transit times by weeks, raising freight costs and tightening supply chains that have only recently stabilized from previous disruptions. A regional conflict can become a global economic event within days. And what of China? Beijing imports a significant portion of its energy through Gulf routes. It has invested heavily in regional infrastructure, ports, and strategic partnerships. Public silence does not equal indifference. Quiet diplomatic channels may already be active. Could China position itself as mediator? Or would it calculate that prolonged instability benefits competitors less prepared for sustained energy volatility? Russia, facing its own geopolitical calculations, may also view a distracted West as strategically advantageous. But even Moscow relies on stable global energy pricing mechanisms. Chaos is rarely contained. The information battlefield continues to expand. Viral clips, some authentic, some manipulated, flood timelines. Claims of additional ships sunk. Claims of missile interceptions. Claims of secret negotiations. Markets move on rumors long before confirmations arrive. In this environment, narrative control becomes almost as critical as maritime control. If populations believe a wider war is inevitable, economic behavior shifts preemptively. Investors hedge. Companies delay. Citizens stockpile. The psychological dimension amplifies the physical one. Now consider the possibility that this confrontation extends beyond the Strait. Proxy groups aligned with Tehran operate across multiple theaters. If maritime options narrow, attention could shift to land borders, to cyber operations, to infrastructure attacks targeting energy grids or financial networks. Cyber capabilities can disrupt port logistics without firing a missile. Digital interference with navigation systems can create confusion in crowded sea lanes. Modern conflict does not require traditional battle lines. At the same time, Washington must weigh global optics. Allies watch carefully. Adversaries measure response patterns. If naval destruction is confirmed and sustained, it signals a willingness to escalate rapidly when economic arteries are threatened. That may deter some actors in other regions contemplating similar leverage strategies. But it may also accelerate arms procurement and asymmetric investment elsewhere. Military demonstrations reverberate far beyond their immediate theater. Inside Iran, economic strain compounds military loss. Sanctions have already limited revenue streams. Oil exports face scrutiny. Currency pressure can intensify if export routes are perceived as unstable. Domestic populations enduring inflation and shortages may question prolonged confrontation. Yet external pressure can also rally nationalist sentiment, consolidating internal cohesion temporarily. The direction depends on messaging, casualty levels, and perceived legitimacy of leadership decisions. And here is the question that experts quietly debate. Did Tehran expect this scale of response? Was the initial tanker incident calibrated under the assumption that Washington would respond symbolically, not structurally? If so, the reported sinking of multiple warships represents a miscalculation of threshold. If not, then perhaps this escalation was anticipated as part of a broader strategy designed to internationalize the conflict and draw in additional actors. In geopolitics, sometimes provoking a powerful response is itself the objective. We must also consider the maritime coalition factor. In previous Gulf crises, multinational naval task forces formed to ensure freedom of navigation. If commercial traffic remains disrupted, calls for expanded patrols will intensify. European navies, Asian partners, and regional forces may coordinate escorts. That raises the density of armed vessels in confined waters, increasing the probability of accidental encounters. A radar misinterpretation, a warning shot misunderstood, a drone misidentified. These are the sparks history warns about. Oil producers outside the region are watching closely. OPEC's decision to increase production may buffer supply in the short term, but logistical constraints limit immediate impact. Strategic petroleum reserves could be tapped, but those are temporary cushions, not permanent solutions. If disruption persists, energy transition narratives may accelerate, but that is a long-term arc colliding with short-term urgency. If you want this story tracked in depth as it develops, if you want analysis that connects military moves to economic consequences and political ripple effects, make sure you are subscribed to this channel and leave a like. It helps this reporting reach viewers who want substance instead of panic. The next moves are already being calculated, and the balance between deterrence and escalation has never been thinner.